Linux Luddites, episode 58, for the 18th of October, 2015. Hello and welcome to Linux Luddites, the show where we trial the latest free and open source software and then decide that we like the old stuff better. I'm Joe.
And I'm Jesse. And this week we look at the updated version of Raspbian, now sitting on top of Raspbian Jessie. We have your feedback and an over a pint discussing governmental backdoors and encryption. Now, we recorded this over a pint last week with Andrew, and so with the magic of editing, he will rematerialise just for that section. And with that, let's get on with our first look at the new Raspbian.
A couple of weeks ago, the new version of Raspbian was released. Now, that is, of course, the officially supported distribution for the Raspberry Pi, supported by the Raspberry Pi Foundation. And they made a fair song and dance about this new release. It was previously based on the old version of Debian Wheezy. Now it's based on Debian Jessie, with an IE, not just an E, like you, Jesse. I know that's a bugbear of yours, but anyway, let's get over that.
Thanks for the clarification, yep.
So I've had a look at this on both the original Pi with the 256 megabytes of RAM and the latest Pi 2. You've got a B Plus and a 2 as well, haven't you?
Yeah, so I looked at it on, the same, the B Plus and the Raspberry Pi 2, and had a little compare with the Raspbian Wheezy as well.
Yeah, I did as well, because I was fairly familiar with it, but I wanted to see the latest version with all the latest updates and compare the two of them kind of on an even ground. And I suppose starting with overall impressions then, I found the new version to be slicker, faster, although I'll get back to that with actual objective benchmarks, but subjectively it felt faster, it felt slicker, it felt just improved in every way, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I've also got some benchmarks for installing things and opening applications and things. But just using the desktop and looking around, it looks very, very similar to the previous version of Raspbian. It still uses the LXD desktop environment. It still has a top bar with a start menu, and it is all very, very familiar. But you're right, it just feels a little bit more peppy, a little bit more snappy. And especially when I had the two Model Bs, one with the new version and one with the previous version, you could do, fairly direct comparisons. And it just felt like a more polished desktop. So they've clearly put a lot of effort into streamlining it and getting rid of any of the hang-ups that there may have been when it comes to, loading applications. The menus just pop out quicker and things. So they've done a lot of work in the background, it looks like.
Yeah, it certainly looks that way. But I mean, aesthetically, it's pretty much identical, isn't it? I mean, if you are familiar with the old one, it's not some new paradigm. As you say, it's still LXDE. Everything's exactly where it was before, with just a few additions. So at least they haven't tried to hugely change it. So I do appreciate that from them, definitely.
And one of those additions is a new ejectable devices icon. So in the top main menu bar, at the very, very right-hand side, to the right of the clock, there's a big sort of eject button. And that allows you to more easily unmount, like whether you've got USB pens or various devices you might have put in. So it allows you to more easily eject it. And I think that's, a lot of people aren't familiar with the sudo umount various sort of commands and things and trying to find whether it's SDB or SDA, especially with multiple partitions for your actual root directory and the way that Raspbian sort of loads onto a SD card is maybe gets a bit confusing for people. So I think having that, a nice sort of GUI graphical interface, does make it a little bit easier for people to pick up. And I think we should probably move on that thread where they've installed a number of applications which are more mainstream.
Well, I mean, before we even get to the applications, the huge difference is that you DD the image onto the card or use Win32 disk imager or whatever, stick it in the Pi, plug it into your screen, turn it on, and it boots to a desktop. Whereas before, it booted to the Ncurse's setup wizard. Now it's straight into a desktop, straight ready to go. So if you've got no experience with Linux, which, let's face it, that's what this is aimed at. And doing the Pi podcast, hey, I had to get that in at some point. But that has really taught me that it's not aimed at Linux users and tinkerers, really. We have kind of picked this up as an almost an afterthought. What it's really aimed at is children, teachers, parents, people who are basically used to Windows or Mac. So it's very much improved on that score, I would say, in that you turn this thing on and you're straight into the desktop. There's no configuration needed at all. You can just get straight on with what you want to do.
Yeah, and no need to log in as Pi and Raspberry as the default password, isn't it? To get you to the GUI and StyX and things. You're right. There's not many hurdles, and for people who are experienced, not even with Linux, but just general computing, it's going to be a fairly simple thing to go through that setup installer and log in, just find on the internet. But I think those are unnecessary hurdles, as you're saying. If people are picking this up, they expect to turn something on and go straight to a desktop environment. So they've made that simple change, and I think it's one of those things that will make it that bit more sort of pick up and go for, like you say, the average user. But coming back to the applications, the one that I was really sort of thinking about was the inclusion of a full LibreOffice suite, which I was surprised to see on the Pi because, it is very low-end hardware. Let's not forget that it's a cheap ARM processor. And so to have what is the sort of mainstay of all Linux desktops, or pretty much all Linux desktops, the LibreOffice suite, on such a low-end device, I was quite surprised about. But I think it also goes to show their drive to try and make it mainstream and sort of this pick up and go for, like say, parents, teachers and kids.
Yeah, I mean, it feels like they're trying to make it everything to everybody. Because for makers, you had everything that you had before, but now it's potentially a viable desktop replacement. Now, I'm not 100% convinced that it is a potential desktop replacement still. I mean, it does feel improved, but I don't know. I mean, I tried out LibreOffice Writer, and I found that to be perfectly fine. I could easily write a long essay or something like that in it. But I don't know about the other things that LibreOffice can do. I don't generally do spreadsheets and stuff like that. You do. Did you get a chance to check out the spreadsheets?
Yeah, so I have a temperature logger on my server because it sits in a cupboard and I'm worried about airflow. So it logs the temperature every 15 minutes, I think. And that's 16,500 lines of date stamps and temperature recordings. I SCP'd the data over to my Pi and loaded it up in it's Calc, isn't it? LibreCalc. And it did take quite a while to get it all loaded in, and I just sort of manipulating. There's a section in the middle where I'd unplugged the USB data logger, the temperature logger, and it obviously isn't finding data there, so there's a lot of error messages. And just to find that section and delete that sort of 100, 200 lines, it sort of struggled because then having to shift the bottom, 10,000 lines up and things like this, and it's just not ready for that swamp of data. And I think if you're going to be writing an essay, you're right, the first page or two might be fine, but as soon as you get to something that I picture students doing, which has images and graphics and graphs and tables and things in it, I can't see it really being able to handle it that well. You're better off writing a few notes and ditties in LeafPad, which it also has, which is a very lightweight text editor. Yeah,
so I mean, that's the question. Is LibreOffice there just for show, really? Because, I mean, you have thrown at it a perfectly real example there, and it didn't really stand up to it, did it? I mean, compared to on a desktop, presumably it's no problem to do that kind of thing on a normal desktop computer.
Yeah, exactly. So I normally edit this information on my main PC. It runs Ubuntu, and you can chuck the data in there. And my big issue is how terrible LibreCalc is, not how slow it is to manipulate the data. So it's a different problem.
Well, let's not get too bogged down with that. But yeah, so I don't know. Do you think that it is just for show then? Is it just to say that they've got it there when it's essentially not even that useful? I guess it's because if you are going to be doing some small bit of data analysis, you are going to be trying to write some information in a report, and the information and the data is coming from your Raspberry Pi. Maybe you've got other sensors and stuff connected to it, and so you're sort of pulling that all in, and you want to do a bit of simple manipulation or maybe some calculations. Yeah, it can do it. And I think it also is a familiar place. People are maybe not entirely familiar with LibreOffice, but it's going to be far more likely they are familiar with one Office suite that has all of your applications, a Word, a Draw, Calc, various bits and bobs like this, rather than
Abbey word versus numeric versus something else, and they seem quite disparate and not sort of joined. So it does give a more comfortable way that people who have maybe never heard of LibreOffice to just be familiar with an Office suite, as they might be, more familiar with the sort of Microsoft way of having a whole suite of things.
But is it not likely that it's going to put people off? I mean, if this is their first experience of Linux and LibreOffice, is it not potentially just going to make them think, well, that's not very good, even though it's not really a fair test because it was on a Raspberry Pi? I mean, if they'd installed it themselves and then it hadn't done very well, then they could say, oh, well, it's only a Raspberry Pi. But I mean, the fact that it's included by default seems to me that it's an endorsement that it's going to work well. And then potentially when it doesn't, it might leave a bad taste in people's mouths.
Yeah, I think unfortunately it's a win, lose, lose, win. So you either have the speed and it looks good, but no one's ever really heard of it and it's maybe not familiar to people, or you sacrifice the speed aspect of it for something which is a familiar sort of Office suite with all of the functionality that you would expect from a full Office suite. And they're trying to do two different things. It's a very low-end computer, but they're trying to make it work with a whole load of different areas and use cases, whereas you're never going to get that perfect harmony unless you've got an actual proper PC or a laptop or something. So they've made the decision to go down this route of having a full suite, and they've clearly got their reasons for it. It's maybe not perfect from a speed point of view, but there's clearly need for it.
Yeah, okay, fair enough. Well, something that is definitely positive is the new version of Scratch, which allows rootless GPIO support. So whereas before, anything that used the GPIO pins needed to be run as sudo, basically, whereas now it doesn't. So that is a huge improvement, and a lot of work has gone on behind the scenes with Scratch and with the GPIO libraries. So it's good that has made it in there, and it really feels like a huge improvement there.
Yeah, definitely. And being able to have all your bash scripts and things not having to be run as root is quite an important thing from a security point of view, but also you don't want something to be messing around and changing files in your root partition and potentially damaging your system if you've maybe not quite got your bash script right. Whereas this way you can allow it to access the GPIO pins and you're never going to actually damage the internals of your system. So yeah, absolutely, it's a great step forwards. I do wonder, however, that the thing that I remember from a year or so ago was the promise of Maynard, the different desktop environment, and there was videos of it, and in fact I tried it on the original Raspberry Pi B and it was pretty slick, it was pretty fast, but I've not heard anything about it. And I looked up on the GitHub page and the last sort of edit was about 10 months ago, and I just wonder why they've just given up on Maynard, which seemed to be looking towards getting a much more slick and sort of smooth interface. Do you think it's just because the hardware has got better, so they've just given up on trying to improve the DE?
Maybe, or maybe it's just because they know that LXDE is working, and why change it? Why have a different experience for people? This is essentially the same experience as I said before. If you're used to Wheezy and you try Jessie, then it's not hugely different, is it? Whereas if they change the desktop environment, then it would be unfamiliar to people.
Yeah, that's a fair point, actually. We did come at the start of this saying it's nice that it's familiar and usable and not changing the paradigm. So yeah, actually that's a good point. Keeping it where people will recognize it does actually help quite a lot. And I've actually just scrolled up to the top of my notes and I've remembered that there's not only the way of obviously installing it by downloading the image and then putting it, DDing it onto an SD card. You can also upgrade, of course. And I watched a YouTube video of someone doing an upgrade from Wheezy to Jessie, and it took like 2 hours. So I mean, if you've got stuff that you want to keep and you want to make sure that everything is as it was and step it up, then by all means do an upgrade, but that's going to take some time. If you've only got a couple of bash scripts or something that's easy to reinstall, I would suggest downloading the new version, getting it on your SD card and just putting your things back on, because that's a serious amount of time to get a machine upgraded.
Yeah, I actually did that a while ago. It must be a couple of months ago, shortly after Jessie came out, the main version. And yeah, it took several hours to do it. But it's not going to give you the same experience if you do an upgrade. And the Foundation clearly say in their release announcement that it's not a good idea to do that. You can if you want, but you're much better off doing a kind of nuke and pave. So I wouldn't recommend it. I mean, unless you absolutely can't lose your config or whatever, but I'm sure it's essentially going to be quicker to copy stuff off and back on again than it is to do this upgrade. And you're going to have a nice clean install with the new features and stuff. So it doesn't seem like a good idea to me. So apart from the newer versions of things, like there's a new version of Sonic Pi and just everything's generally updated, there are a couple of new programming applications for developing Java, and they're BlueJ and Greenfoot. Now, I know you don't know much about programming. I know nothing about programming, but I know someone who develops Java professionally. So I asked him, my friend Isaac, who I do the Pi podcast with. Sorry, I had to get another plug in there. And he said to me that he would never use these two for professional work because they're just too limited. But I asked him if it would be a good introduction to Java. And he said, if you've never done any programming before, then it would be a bit bamboozling. Like, I mean, I personally opened it up and BlueJ and Greenfoot and just had no idea what was going on because I don't understand about how to program Java. But he said if you've got a little bit of programming knowledge, then these two would both be great tools for getting into Java. You'd have to fairly quickly move on to something better. But as an introduction, they are probably quite a good idea. So, now you've got Scratch, you've got Python, and you've got Java. So it seems like a good idea to include that. I mean, that's the kind of whole point of the Raspberry Pi, is to get kids into programming. And the more options, the better, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And like you said, I'm not the master at programming, and so I had a little poke around in them, and they seem to do what they say on the tin. But if it's something that you're interested in, or you've maybe started, then it's nice having them there and ready to go. They're by the University of Kent and Oracle, so sort of a collaborative bit of software there. I was having a look around, just using it as a general PC, as it were, and it comes with Iceweasel, so it doesn't come with Firefox and things you recognise. It's the stripped out one from Debian. And I was surprised to see, I don't know if you tried YouTube videos, and I had a real trouble with YouTube. It may be 1 in 10 videos played, and the rest of them sort of just skipped about and didn't actually do anything sensible, which I was quite surprised. And I thought, this is the sort of thing that, I mean, everyone Googles stuff these days, but everyone also looks at YouTube videos of how to do things, especially when it comes to physical hardware for the Raspberry Pi, maybe connecting cameras or using the GPIO pins and things. I was surprised to see that YouTube wasn't as usable as I'd expect it to be. So that was a bit of a negative, or the only negative I really found, if I'm honest.
Well, it just isn't beefy enough, I think, is the problem. The hardware is just not good enough. Unless you've got specific video codecs and you can use hardware acceleration, any sort of CPU accelerated video is just going to be rubbish and choppy and just not work, basically. Even really low resolution stuff. I mean, I have previously tried VLC and stuff, and it's just not happening. The media playback without accessing the GPU is just not feasible, really. So I'm not at all surprised that you had YouTube problems. I mean, I didn't even try, to be honest. I just know that it's not really capable.
Fair enough. Well, if we're going to have a little look at the sort of the speed specs, as it were, what were the tests you did and what were your results?
So I did the Pi to 5,000 digits test that we had a kind of poll about many months ago on our Google Plus community. And that you type in time echo scale equals 5,000, blah, blah, blah. And it works out Pi to 5,000 digits, and how many seconds that takes, the lower, the better, obviously. And I was very surprised to see that on the Pi 1, Jessie did it in about 85% of the time that it did on Wheezy. And on the Pi 2, it was similar, 83% of the time. So it was significantly quicker. Now, this is with the same SD card and just everything otherwise exactly the same exact Pi. And so that shows that Jessie has been optimized for some things. But then I did some hard info benchmarks. You've got the various ones there, and they were much of a muchness, really. I spent quite a long time doing it and then looked at my results and I was like, oh, okay, well, generally speaking, on the Pi 1, Jessie's slightly worse at those benchmarks, and on the Pi 2, it's slightly better. So, I mean, they were fairly close to each other. I didn't have time to run multiple benchmarks, so it might just be, slight anomalies there. I would have thought that if you did enough hard info benchmarks, they would probably work out to be on a par with each other. So I'm not quite sure why that pi test was better, but otherwise, I think that from an objective point of view, I'd say they're roughly about the same speed as each other, which was strange given that my subjective experience was that Jessie is snappier and quicker and just faster.
Okay, well, let me pick up that thread, because I think I did a few more, I would describe them as more sort of real world tests, I think. So I looked at the boot times for Raspbian Wheezy and Raspbian Jessie, and I had 1 minute 20 for Wheezy and 57 seconds for Jessie. So there's a 20-second saving there. It was down to like 18 seconds on the Raspberry Pi 2, but that's obviously just sheer hardware grunt. I did an install, and I installed Clementine, which is a Qt music application. I just plucked an application out of the air, which I knew it wouldn't have. And it took 8.5 minutes to install that on Wheezy and 6 minutes 50 to install it on Jessie. So there's a couple of minutes save in there. So what you're saying about having real world sort of speed improvements and feeling quicker, it certainly was. There's 2 minutes saved just to install this application. Now, moving it forward to the Raspberry Pi 2, that took 49 seconds. So while we're saying almost 7 minutes for Jessie on a Raspberry Pi Model B, Jessie on the Raspberry Pi Model 2 is less than a minute. So that's, again, just hardware grunt, but it shows that you're at speeds which don't feel that slow. Well, let me put it into perspective. It took 9 seconds on my main PC. So 49 seconds suddenly does feel a bit slow, but you're a lot quicker. You're saving serious amounts of time. And my last sort of real world kind of test was to load theverge.com. Theverge.com is a great resource for tech information, all that sort of stuff. But my word, it has a heavy website. It's got so much going on and so many things that load, it takes ages. So my Chromebook took 15 seconds to load it. My PC took 8 seconds to load it. They were wireless and wired respectively. Now, Wheezy took 2 minutes to load it, and Jessie on the equivalent Raspberry Pi took 1 minute 13, and then on the Raspberry Pi 2 took 45 seconds. So just looking at the difference for the same hardware, for the Wheezy installation versus the Jessie installation, that's 2 minutes to 1 minute 13, which is a huge improvement. It's almost halving it, and that's the sort of real world feeling that you get, is that while you're not at main PC speed, you're not even at Chromebook speeds, but you are certainly, it's more usable, you're waiting for less time, and I think that's the sort of impression I got. And my numbers did sort of back up this idea that, like you say, it feels peppier, it feels more responsive, and clearly a lot of work has gone in, and it's really paid off.
Well, yeah, I suppose doing real-world benchmarks is probably a better idea. Maybe I should do that in future rather than just relying on hard info. But hard info is just so easy to do. You just click it and you get a number and you can stick that in a spreadsheet and see where you are. But, I mean, that goes to show then that my feeling is right, that it is snappier, Jessie. It is just better all around. I mean, I have been uncharacteristically positive about this, but there is a bit of a negative, a bit of a kind of elephant in the room here. And that is, the way I see it, they have sacrificed security for ease of use. Now, that's always a balance, isn't it? It's always kind of a trade-off. And I think one of the big problems I have with it is you boot into it and there's never a mention of security updates at all. There's no even way to do it with a GUI. There's no synaptic. The only way to update it is with the command line. Now, if you are someone who's never used Linux before, a parent or whatever, or a teacher who's just getting into this, and you boot into it, connect to the internet, and off you go. I mean, right now, it's a fairly new release, so there aren't many security updates to be had. But as we go down the line, there will be critical security flaws that need to be patched. And there isn't any prompting to do that updating. And also, you can sudo things without having to enter the password, which is surely a security risk. I mean, that just doesn't seem like a good idea to me. And also, there's no prompting to change the password. Now, everything that was in that ncurses setup wizard is in a nice new GUI, which is in the menu, but you have to go and look for that. And granted, there aren't many things in the menu, so you'll probably come across it. But in theory, you might not. And so you might end up not changing the default password. You've got sudo without having to enter that password, and you've got no prompting to update the thing, which overall just screams security nightmare to me.
Yeah, I would normally want to add something, but I think you've absolutely nailed it. I've got a line in my notes that says, where is a software updater / installer? Why is there not a GUI for, like you say, updating? Why is there not a GUI for allowing you to install things? Or even if they were, like Ubuntu Mate has done, where it's got a sort of a selected group of applications that have been blessed. And maybe they could have a selected group of applications that have been blessed for use on the Raspberry Pi because they're more efficient or they're educational or been, screened for whatever you may not want children to see. Then you could have those. But the very idea, exactly like you say, the very idea that there's no prompt for updates, I was really surprised. And I like the fact that there's no sudo password, but you're absolutely right. That is a huge security problem. It's just laziness that means I don't have to put a password in. But you really, really should.
Yeah, it's convenient. It's easy. It's convenient, but it's it's a security risk to do that. And so I can see why they've done it, but it's just, I think that it's something that they should think more about security. It's just because it's the first thing I always do is get things up to date, because that to me is the fundamental reason why I use Linux, I think, is security, because I just had enough of antivirus and worrying about that stuff. But it all falls apart if you don't stay up to date, if you don't patch your system and all your applications. So that's always the first thing on my mind when I try anything out is, can I get this up to date and patch everything?
Yeah, as you mentioned, in the new configuration GUI, you can sort of change the host name and whether it boots to desktop or not. You can still choose to boot to CLI if you fancy, and all the various other things you could do, like expanding the SD card and things. And I wonder whether in there, if there was just a button that said update, that would be somewhere that people would know to go. It's in the configuration. That is that sort of technical nuts and bolts, if you will. And once they get used to it, they might do that once a week or so and be able to update it themselves. But if you're trying to produce a Raspberry Pi, which is moving people away from the command line, and there's no other way than updating it other than via the command line, it seems like there's a gap there that needs to be filled.
Yeah, and I know that it's not an easy thing to do, to write an updater, and Synaptic is potentially a little bit heavy, but I don't know, there's got to be a way. I think that they've got to concentrate on that. You can't just give people a system and encourage children and teachers and parents, like I keep saying, to use a system that is insecure. And, just because it's Linux doesn't mean it's secure unless you update it. So I don't know. Maybe I'm going on too much about this, but it seems to be quite a fundamental problem with it that sort of just dawned on me after a while, because the first thing I did was update it. Presumably that was one of the first things you did as well, via the command line, because we're used to that. But the kind of people who this is aimed at are just not used to that. So, yeah, I think that's one for them to think about. And I think the other negative is the size of it. Now, Wheezy was 3.4 gigabytes and fit on a 4 gig SD card just about. This is now 4.3 gigabytes, so a whole gigabyte more for all of the stuff like LibreOffice. And I don't know, is that bloated?
I'm not sure whether I'd say it's bloated. Standard Ubuntu installs is significantly bigger than that. It's fairly minimalist. But at the same time, it really pained me because I have a whole host of 4 gig cards and they all had to be binned because this is, I was liking the fact that I could chop and change and have a different card for every different install I've got, and maybe one's for temperature logging and one's for time-lapse photography, or one's just for having on the back of my PC for a media server and things like this. But the fact that now they're all dead and I had to go rooting through a whole host of other SD cards I use in cameras and things to try and find ones that were big enough for this. So maybe I was always a little bit behind the times with only using 4 gig cards, but I clearly need to go and buy some new ones.
Yeah, I mean, they're cheap enough, but it's just a case of I'm sure there are plenty of 4 gig cards lying around which are useless now. So yeah, it's I suppose it's just inevitable. The more stuff you put in there, the bigger it's going to get. But yeah, maybe. Well, we talked about LibreOffice enough, but that I think is the crux of it, really.
Yeah, it's a shame we've ended up on a bit of a sour note, but I think overall, would you agree that it's a brilliant improvement? It's certainly snappier, and with more applications, it produces more usability.
Definitely, yeah. I think security woes aside, it's brilliant. It's much better than it was before. For me personally, it makes it much more usable. And I'm sorry to say, Martin, but this is a real challenger to Ubuntu Mate now. Whereas before, Raspbian felt a little bit limited, whereas Ubuntu Mate was the full desktop experience. Now you've got a full desktop experience with this, so Ubuntu Mate is going to have to do something special, I think, with the 15.10 release for the Pi to make it stand out against this. So, apart from that security thing, very, very positive about this. And I just think they need to push out the slimmed down command line version, which is going to be significantly smaller size-wise. And there's a lot of call for that. And they say that's on the agenda, so hopefully that'll come out sooner rather than later. But yeah, overall, I would say pretty much thumbs up. On to the feedback then. And first of all, a huge thanks to our new monthly supporter, Michael Kane. Very much appreciated. And of course, to all of our existing monthly supporters.
Absolutely. Really, really appreciated. And knowing that we get monthly income means that we can, put some aside after we've done the server costs and things and plan for new things on the show.
Yeah, it's always welcome. And it says in huge letters, give them our contact details. So you can email us, show@linuxluddites.com, or you can leave a comment on the website, or there's Twitter, Facebook, or Google+.
Now, there's, of course, lots of feedback yearning for Paddy to return, and don't worry, after you've been hearing this, he will be back on the next one. And others pleased to hear Pete back podcasting. Morten Juel Johansson Zolder Fürher was one of them. However, he called out Pete on 2 points. He says, first, when people ask about a Linux distribution not giving you all the software you need when you switch, which OS does that? In Linux, we have a usable browser, a real Office suite, CD, DVD, burning software, non-crippled media players, and other actually useful stuff. Second, do we have a problem about Linux appealing to all the more technical users? Even if it's not real, it offers some extra good things for the people who want to get into the system. And this sort of sets us up nicely for the main thread of our feedback this week, the differing opinion between Linux being easy for all and new users, and Linux being more fun, or you could read more technical for the people who want to get into the nuts and bolts.
Yeah, Dennis Wickman said, maybe it's just me, but I seem to be growing tired of the promises, the delays, and the continual bickering between developers of what framework or whatever else is best overall. To Ubuntu, I say kudos to you for taking the responsibility of making Ubuntu available as you intended. Yes, I understand they've gone away from the FOSS ethos, and yes, I understand and credit that it is built on a Debian base. While Unity is not for me, it is there, ready, and it is stable, and it just works. If the dev community and the users of open source are truly satisfied with the offerings in 2015, then all power to you. I am not. In all honesty, I see myself slipping away to something like Android and using tech to simply consume. I guess I'm saying I'm rapidly losing my affinity with OSs altogether. For the record, and of no surprise, Win 10 is no better. A bumbling and poor attempt to be all things to all people out of the box. Apples, of course, for eating.
Yes, that's sort of a vote there for keeping Linux simple and making sure that everyone can use it rather than getting it all complicated. And Lynn Dixon wrote in to say, great show, great discussion. I'd like to see Linux folks get a table at all Microsoft events and have just 3 things on the table. An old computer loaded with Linux Mint, and a new computer running Ubuntu or KDE, and a stack of bootable DVDs folks can take. Even someone who loves Windows is going to think of their mum or kid who's got an old machine that can't run Windows anymore. Even if we can't sell the hardline Windows users for their own machines, what Linux rocks at in comparison can sell them for someone else's machine. And it's an idea which Keith ZG brought up to date by suggesting a pile of USB sticks in place of the DVDs.
But yeah, that seems like quite a good idea, showing that, you can revitalize old hardware, because I know a lot of people have an old laptop, it slows down with Windows, they think, oh, my laptop is broken, I need to replace it, so they buy a new fancy one. But if you had a laptop that was old, running Mint Mate or something like that, and showed them actually with Linux, you can revitalize this, you can actually still use that machine, you don't have to throw it away. I think that's a very good idea. And I don't know about DVDs. I suppose the kind of machines that you're aiming at there, the older machines, would be able to boot from a DVD, but USB sticks are a bit easier. Well, I suppose USB sticks aren't easy, because generally you have to kind of mess around with BIOS settings, whereas often a laptop will boot from CD by default anyway. So yeah, I can see both. Maybe have both there, DVDs and USB sticks.
Yeah, Keith's point was brought on about the fact that he had a bunch of friends over for sort of a LAN party, and they had all had PCs or laptops, it must have been, that only had USB ports. And on that computer, obviously, like you say, it's going to be fairly easy to boot from USB. But I've had some old laptops, and some very old laptops, let's admit it, that don't boot from USB. So you've had to use clever ways of getting around it. And so actually DVDs, like you say, on old laptops, they're pretty much ubiquitous. So may well be that if you're aiming for that sort of group, then that's what you're going to need. But continuing the ways to introduce Linux to the populace, Esbeeb gave us his top 5 ways to advocate Linux and open source, and these are the slightly abridged versions. So 1, learn the big rule of salesmanship. Never say anything derogatory about any FOSS technology and gloss over any uncomfortable areas. Focus on the strengths.
Okay, so stop doing this show then, by the sounds of things. Okay, carry on.
Let's hope people who are looking at switching aren't coming to us first.
Yeah.
2, never use the word Linux. People have preconceived notions about it being difficult, problematic, or complicated. 3, pick the absolutely most user-friendly distro and evangelize that. In my humble opinion, that's Elementary OS. It's much more consistent and coherent feeling than all the other distros, because all the apps look and feel like they came from one corporation. This warm fuzziness is so very, very important to non-techie people.
I'm not sure about that. I think that there can be many arguments as to what is the most user-friendly distro. For me, it would be Linux Mint. It depends what you're coming from. If you're coming from Windows XP or Windows 7, then Mint Cinnamon is very user-friendly, I think. Whereas Elementary OS is, it might look consistent, but it doesn't work very well. We gave it a very bad review, or at least I did. So I think that is another problem, that you're going to have a huge issue agreeing on what is the right distro to recommend there. But if we could all agree, then maybe that would be the way forward, but I'm not sure on that.
Yeah, and with Elementary OS, if you install different applications, they won't come with the sort of Elementary OS look and feel, so they actually stick out even worse than they would do if you just installed them, like you say, on Cinnamon or something. So it may well not be as smooth as people would want it to be. Carrying on, number 4, I'm not entirely sure about. Figure out who hates the United States and evangelize to them. You know, all those poor countries that have been taken advantage of by them. It's they who are going to be your easy converts in droves. And number 5, only show the most high-level convenient features. That is to say, the applications. Learn the GUI way of doing everything and show them the GUI method, even if it takes 5 times longer than on the command line. So I think that's right. I think, as we were talking about with the Raspberry Pi, having things that you can do on the GUIs makes people a lot more comfortable, and it's what they're used to coming from Windows and things. And while, generally I think the listeners of this show will know the benefits of the command line, the speed, the efficiency you can get with it, people aren't going to want to see it, and it feels very, very sort of 1980s, and it's not a way that you're going to sell it to people, is it?
Yeah, I think that is a very good point. Everything needs to be in a GUI, yeah. And that's why I recommend Linux Mint to people, because I honestly believe that for general, basic, day-to-day use, you should never have to use the terminal in Linux Mint. I honestly don't think you ever need to do that. I'm not sure about Elementary OS, probably. I've never given it enough time to say that for sure, but yeah, definitely with Linux Mint, and probably Ubuntu as well, and Ubuntu Mate. There are GUI ways to do things. They might be slower, but you can use them. So, yeah, good point. Now, Moritz got in touch to tell us about something called Linux Presentation Day. He said, in Germany, we've started an event called Linux Presentation Day. It is planned to be held 2 times a year. The first time will be held on the 14th of November in 60 plus cities across Austria, Germany, and Switzerland. The concept is quite simple. Attract potential users by having a regular event with a brand people can trust. This is not a conference, but a show and tell event. This means having a room full of computers with different stations where people can learn what Linux is and how to accomplish different tasks with it, e.g. managing photos, office stuff, gaming, Raspberry Pi, and reviving an XP relic with modern software, etc. We have global guidelines with do's and don'ts. For example, the command line does not exist. Restrict yourself to a choice of 2 newbie-friendly distros and desktop environments. Have an old box as an XP migration example. I just wanted to inform you that something like this exists and will report back after the event in my town in some months. And so there's a link to the overall one and a list of the participating cities. Now that is pretty much exactly what SB was talking about, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't think it's a coincidence that the do's and don't global guidelines, of which they were just a small selection, some of them are exactly the same from Moritz as from Ebsbeeb. And it's things like not making it difficult, i.e. don't have 13 different distributions you can choose from, don't show them the command line, use the GUI, these sorts of things. And these are ways in which people will not be scared off from it. So, and it's interesting to see that they've got these days which are happening, and it's every 6 months or so. So if you are in Germany, Austria or Switzerland, do have a look and do see if there's one near you. And if you've got some expertise, go along and help them out. There's a whole load of things online where if you want to set it up, there's pre-made sort of pamphlets and posters and stuff. So it makes it quite easy to set up rather than all of the organisers having to do all their own work. However, I said at the top that we had some people saying we should make Linux nice and simple for everyone. And we're now going to move on our tour of European correspondence onto how Linux should be fun and maybe should stick with the more technical side. So Moonshine got in touch from the Ukraine, and he said, I wanted to talk about how everything is so Ubuntu-centric. People seem to draw a fat red line on the ground and say, all right, here are the distributions for normal people that are stable, mature, and can be used in production. They're called Ubuntu and Linux Mint. And there are server distros and distros for geeks who have nothing better to do with their time. To be honest, I think the efforts to make Linux appeal to an absolutely non-technical user is misplaced. You have to be a little bit of a geek to have any reason to use Linux at all or to enjoy it. Otherwise, Microsoft and Apple got you covered. No Linux distro will ever be as polished and streamlined as a commercial OS. There aren't enough resources to compete. It's a pipe dream. Linux is a viable desktop OS and has been for a long time. It's just for people who are a bit enthusiastic about their computers. Always was meant to be.
I completely disagree, Moonshine. I'm sorry, but that's just not true at all. I think that it should be aimed at non-technical users. I mean, my mum, who had never used a computer before, I gave her Linux Mint with XFCE, and before I knew it, she was finding pirate streams of TV shows and stuff to watch. She has no idea how to use a computer, but she gets on with it fine. And she sometimes sees me updating it with the command line, and I tell her why I'm doing that because it's quicker than the GUI method that I showed her how to do. And usually there aren't many updates to do because she's been doing them. And, I just totally disagree that it's not as slick either. I think that it can be as slick as a commercial OS. I don't think that's a pipe dream at all. I mean, I always go back to Linux Mint, and you could argue Ubuntu. I mean, I go to Linux Mint because I don't like Unity, but if you'd never used a computer, then Unity would probably be fine. And it is slick. I mean, the applications on the platform might not be as slick, and the commercial offerings aren't there, like Photoshop and stuff like that. But the actual OS, I think, is fine. And the basic applications, I mean, you can install Chrome on there. You've got Firefox. LibreOffice is all right. I just don't agree, I'm afraid. I think that it's just not true. And maybe I don't want it to be true, but that's the way I feel about it.
Yeah, I suppose his point might have been that in that situation, your example there, your mum would have been perfectly happy with Windows.
Well, yeah, she could have used Windows, like my dad does, but it slows down, and I didn't want to have the hassle of having to deal with that and having to reinstall it all the time. And I knew that she would be likely to be going out looking for TV show streams and stuff, because that's kind of what she told me she wanted to do. She'd heard that you can do that. And so I thought, well, security risks and stuff with Windows, I'll just teach you the importance of updating and hopefully it'll be fine. So that's why I went for Linux with that. And she's just been perfectly happy with it.
Yeah, you shouldn't have to be forced onto Windows to use your PC, should you?
Yeah, exactly. But Dieu 3X or DEU X3X, that's not an easy name to say, sorry, made the kind of same point as Moonshine and said, hey guys, just recently started following the show. Just wanted to point out something that seemed a bit odd to me. Y'all call yourselves the Linux Luddites, where you try all the newest free and open source software and then decide that you like the old stuff better. Man, that's hard to say, not exactly how I say it. However, for the most part, it appears you're all using some sort of Ubuntu spin and actually expressed relief at using the Ubiquity installer on a test spin of Chromixium. I think it's funny that despite your tagline and namesake, you seem to enjoy the red-headed stepchild of Debian and derivatives thereof. Are the advanced distros, as they're often called, too much work, or are they too difficult to set up? I'm genuinely curious, as I've never had more fun than when using Gentoo, which in one of the recent episodes was mentioned almost derisively, like it's a silly distro choice. Well, much like your username, it is a silly distro choice. The thing with Gentoo is, if you've got loads of time, then it makes sense. And I've tried it out before and I just got fed up with it. It takes too long. I think it boils down to laziness. If you use an Ubuntu flavor or derivative, it's really easy to set up and it just works. I'd hate to use that phrase. It really annoys me when people say it about Macs, but it really does just work. Whereas all of the other distros that I've tried, and believe me, I have tried them all pretty much, all the major ones, and I tried to run Debian for a while, they're just not as good, not as easy, and just more of a hassle.
Exactly, and also when you're doing a show like this, you need to know that you can turn it on and it will run and you can meet up on Skype and have Audacity and look at the internet, all these sorts of things. Use whatever programs we need to do this show and none of them will flake over. I mean, I reluctantly update before a show. I generally do it as soon as we put the mics down afterwards and then if there's any problems. But I have done it before the shows and nothing ever goes wrong. Whereas it was interesting speaking to Andrew off air last week and he was saying that one of the guys with him that does the Linux Voice podcast runs Arch. I'm not going to name names, but I think you can work it out. And he always has problems and, you know, there'll be something that he's updated and it's crashed this that used to work or this two things have come together and it's not working. Whatever it might be. And it's just that sort of the question over doing an update. And I know that if you use Arch and you look at all of the things and you plan it and all these sorts of things, but it's a lot of effort to do. And like you say, effort requires time. And we're sort of, dare I say it, busy looking at other distros and doing research and things like this. And it's nice just having a stable base, which you know where it is, and you're confident that it will be there next week for when we start the recording again.
Yeah, I mean, I've got my test laptop that I throw any old distro on and check out, and I like to do that. I like to try out new stuff, but for my daily driver, my work production laptops, I need something that I can rely on and that I know inside out, and that's why I'm still using Ubuntu 14.04, because I know that it's going to work for me. Now, we're not always correct on this show. Sometimes we make mistakes and miss things out. And we had a couple of people getting in touch, pointing out things that we got wrong. And the first one is from Keith Sedgey and Wes Mason, who told you, Jesse, that if you use apt instead of apt-get, you get a progress bar.
Yeah, they pointed out that rather than using apt-get and then install or update or what have you, you can just run apt-install in the package name or apt-upgrade. And when it installs, it does all of the collecting of the various packages and things. And then at the point where it's installing, it gives you a progress bar for not just each package that it's installing, but for the whole lot. And when I was actually doing our Raspbian review, I looked on Wheezy, it didn't allow apt to work. Whereas when I ran it on Jessie and used apt, it did work. So I always thought that apt was an alias that was on Mint. And now I think about it, that might be install as an alias. Anywho, it did work on the Jessie version of Raspbian. And I have to say, it was slick. It was nice. I like the progress bar. It's shorter to type. And as long as I can get over my muscle memory of apt-get, I will be using it in the future. So thanks for that pointer. It's absolutely brilliant.
Yeah, it's a strange one that I didn't know about that. I knew it from Linux Mint, and I've checked it out, and it does seem to work quite well. So yeah, I don't think I'll get over that muscle memory though. Unfortunately, I think it'll be a long time before I kind of remember to not type the -get.
And on our OpenSUSE review, Gabriel 3 wrote in to say, Factory and Tumbleweed are definitely not the same thing. The former is the development branch, the latter is an OpenQA successfully tested rolling release, pretty much bleeding edge. As a bleeding edge distro, your stability experience may vary. I had no issue on Tumbleweed within 6 months, while I had a couple running Manjaro in 1 month. Also, OpenSUSE Leap is in heavy development while pretty usable. I'm writing from it, but it's still not released. The current OpenSUSE 13.2 is its own codebase, while Leap 42 will share its codebase with SUSE Linux, an enterprise grade. A great reorganisation of the whole OpenSUSE project is still ongoing. He also pointed out that neither of us mentioned the Pacman repository, which is kind of mandatory running OpenSUSE because he says it hosts the non-free stuff. And also, only one of us doing the review seem to be aware of the OpenSUSE build service, when you can find lots of packages and install them with the one-click install method. In my opinion, are far better than the Ubuntu PPA system. And he goes on to say, the installer is the most powerful in the Linux galaxy. Good automatic proposals and full power options. As an example, you see the automatic proposed partition setup happens only if one first accepted the proposed disk setup and then go back to the expert partitioner. If you go directly into the expert partitioner, you have a powerful tool.
Now, I never said that it wasn't powerful. In fact, I think I did say that. It clearly is powerful and it's enterprise grade. But just from a user's point of view, I find it confusing and I think there are too many options in there. But I do understand why it needs to have all those options to have that power. It's, I suppose, a bit like the Fedora installer, but even more powerful. So, yeah, I mean, that seems fair enough to call it the most powerful in the Linux galaxy. So, yeah, fair enough.
Yeah, clearly a very keen OpenSUSE user and makes some really good points about the benefits of it and the areas that you would get to know if you maybe dug a little bit deeper and used it as a daily driver for 6 months as he has.
Yeah, I think that's probably the best way. The only fair way is to actually use it, as you say, as a daily driver for a long period of time, because there's a lot to get into with SUSE, definitely. So Ian Kelling said, I avoid proprietary software whenever feasible, so I was a bit disappointed when you said that MusicTube was proprietary after you talked it up. And I was also unsure if Minitube was also proprietary freeware at that point, since I didn't remember you making a distinction between free to download with whether it was free or proprietary. I'd appreciate it if you would let us know up front when you're discussing proprietary software. And then he talks about the kind of benefits of free software and all fairly obvious stuff, really. And Paddy replied to Ian and explained that Minitube and Music are licensed under GPL v3, and you can get the full source from the GitHub repo, but that MusicTube is proprietary. And yeah, we should have flagged it up kind of at the start. We always tend to. I mean, Paddy's better at it than us. Kind of whenever we do a distro, it's kind of assumed to be GPL, but when we do applications, we really ought to specify the license. So yeah, thanks for calling us out on that. We'll try and do better in future.
And finally, a personal apology from me to Helem Serene, who is a man. When I was reading out his feedback a fortnight ago, I slipped and said he was a she. So my apologies to that. I will learn that Helem is a man's name in the future.
Okay, well, that's it for the feedback. Let's move on to the over a pint. Now, bear in mind that all things being equal, the OggCamp interview that was played last week would have gone here, but because of time constraints and because OggCamp's coming up, we thought we would switch them around and give you the OggCamp interview then. So let's go back in time and welcome Andrew back to the show. In the last couple of weeks, you can't have missed the fact that Edward Snowden is now on Twitter, and he's got loads and loads of followers, and he's kind of doing a bit of journalism now and promoting this idea that we need to have encryption on the internet and we can't have it banned by governments. And David Cameron was talking about that a while back, and I presume that's still on the agenda to try and ban encryption. And so the question is, can governments really actually do that? Can they ban encryption? And Andrew, I think you've got a quite simple answer to that.
Yeah, the answer is no. to elaborate, they can ban it. Of course they can. They can pass the law, but you won't achieve anything by banning it. When they banned alcohol in the United States, that didn't have any effect. I mean, we've effectively banned speeding in this country. That's illegal. People do it. People do all sorts of things that are against the law. You could ban boxing. It'd go underground. We've banned drugs. Drugs have been banned in this country for a very long time. People still take drugs. So regardless of the technical merits of the argument, which are really actually quite compelling, you can't change anything by banning anything.
So you have an issue with the idea of banning it, not the idea of allowing them backdoors into it.
Oh, I also have an issue with that. Because, we need encryption. Encryption is massively important, and any system that depends on the right man being in charge, or any system that depends on a good man being in charge, is a bad system. And that's what backdoors are. Trust us. We won't do anything bad with it. No, of course you won't. But the next bloke might.
Yeah, well, the idea that even if, let's say, the government released a encryption method that had a UK government way of getting in, so that everything that was shared between the UK government or between UK citizens had a way that the government could approve it and make sure that no one was doing anything untoward or underhand or in the shadows and things, and everyone was happily using it, knowing that everything was encrypted from everyone else, and only, let's say, there was a good guy in government that could open that back door and check everything, we would live in peaceful harmony and everything would be fine. Up until the point the key to that back door was taken by someone who we don't like, whichever country it is of the time that you listen to this, because they seem to be changing all the time at the moment.
East Eurasia, is it?
Right, yeah. Yeah, exactly. Basically, anyone on the border of Russia currently is a potential difficulty. And if they get that backdoor key, everything that has ever been sent or stored or saved or used with that encryption method is entirely vulnerable. And it's the idea that even if we had a perfect government and they were entirely trustworthy, there are some biggest ifs I've ever said, but if that was happening, it's the fact that everything would be unlocked with one key and you would never be able to rely on it because everything would just be open to whomever had that key.
Okay, so it sounds like the answer is yes, the government can do it by basically mandating these backdoors. And you could argue that with free software, they can't have backdoors in it. But let's just say that they can do it. Do you think they will do it or not? Or do you think that it's all hyperbole and just trying to, placate people saying, this is our fight against the terrorists sort of thing?
Yes, the latter. It's security theatre. It's designed to reassure the people who say that something must be done. So here we are doing something, and you don't need to worry about it. You can just go back to being afraid.
Yeah, I was watching Question Time yesterday, and they had a chap on there who was talking about this problem of everyone having to do something, and the idea that if someone attacks another country, we have to actively go and do something. If someone has a way in which they could plot a terrorist plot against us, we have to actively do something. And there's not the idea that you might pause and think and consider and look at the two arguments and actually say, by steaming in there and actively doing something, Iraq, for example, we are maybe not helping the bigger picture. We should maybe think about it a little bit more. And I think this is, you're absolutely right, where the Conservative government in this country has seen terror plots and they have to be seen to do something. Well, that thing is talking about making encryption and backdoors in encryption and things like this, and it's not going to help anyone, and it's not, as we've discussed, not really feasible either. So it's because you have to do something, and it's almost it's by doing something you're undoing the usefulness. You might as well just leave it and accept that these things can't be changed, and you're better off everyone having secure encryption, because, like I said, if someone had a backdoor key and that key got lost, everyone's got open access to all the things that were encrypted.
The brilliance of making a big noise about encryption and saying that, we should ban encryption because terrorists use it, is that won't fail at a political level. That will only fail at a technical level. So you can go to your conference and stand in front of all the geriatric people who voted for you and talk to them about this thing that they don't really understand, but it sounds very encouraging because you're talking about terrorism and safety and the national interest. And then when it fails later down the line, because it will fail, because every single technical expert just laughs at it, when it fails, it's not your fault. It's the fault of somebody else who you will never see. You can say, oh, it's, unfortunately it's the nature of the internet, or it's, oh, Facebook don't want to do it, or, oh, it's Google's fault, or even just the technology isn't available yet. We'd really like to do this, and we have the will to do it, we have the mandate to do it, but the technology isn't just quite available just yet. And that's a blameless fail.
But one of the solutions that people talk about is making HTTPS be the standard so that all web traffic goes over secure, encrypted means. Now, the way to do that is for everyone to have a certificate, which at the moment is generally quite expensive, or at least there is a cost involved. But there's the Let's Encrypt project from the Linux Foundation and others to try and essentially force everyone to HTTPS, which sounds like an excellent idea on the surface of things, doesn't it? It sounds like, yeah, well, if we're all HTTPS'd up, then we're not going to have a problem and no one's going to be snooping on us. Until you think about the fact that if Let's Encrypt really does take off, and I don't see why it wouldn't, given that it's free to anyone and therefore that's barrier has been taken away, and the fact that it's supposed to be easier. I've not had a chance to try it yet, but it's at least supposedly easier than a normal certificate to install. And so if we get to that stage where almost everyone's website is encrypted using this Let's Encrypt initiative, then you've got a single point of failure. All you have to do is take over that certificate authority and you've suddenly got access to everyone's traffic.
So it's a case of monopoly becoming too powerful and therefore a single point of failure, you're saying?
Yeah. And even with things like perfect forward secrecy, it's not 100% if you've got this central certificate authority, this centralized body that is relatively easy to take over. All the government of any particular country has to do is take them over. So again, that's kind of security theater, I think, in that you're kind of lulling people into this false sense of security that everything's encrypted, everything's hunky-dory, you can say whatever you want on the internet and no one's going to be listening, whereas the reality is probably not the case.
But isn't the problem with HTTPS everywhere that certain companies need to be able to see the web traffic in order to put ads into it? I mean, isn't that part of the reason that we have people knowing what you're searching and therefore knowing how to advertise at you, which is, as we've talked on a previous show, how revenue for a lot of the websites that we like, use and read actually are able to maintain, the page and the journalists and things by having ads on it. If everything was secure from end to end, no one would be able to know who was looking at it, and therefore would be able to put specific ads on it, which you should in theory click and would, I think that having specific ads is better because I don't want ads for everything ever. I'd rather have ads for laptops and male t-shirts than anything else. So it sort of seems kind of counterintuitive that you would actually want everything to be secure because people wouldn't be able to actually fund the websites that you're going to.
Do you have adverts on your site, Andrew? I mean, I wouldn't know because I'm ad blocked up to the max.
Oh, you're killing music. You're as bad as home taping. Yeah, we do. We do have ads. We're quite selective of what we have on there. We know that it's we could get more money by dealing with some slightly less acceptable people, but why bother for the amounts of money involved? You might make an extra couple of quid to have a Microsoft advert or a Dell advert, but it's just not worth it.
Yeah, you've got an O'Reilly Oscon advert, which I think is fairly acceptable, to be honest.
Exactly. No one's going to mind that. O'Reilly Oscon is relevant content. It's good for them. It's good for us. It's potentially it's good for the readers. So fantastic. We're not going to start advertising, the Daily Mail or anything.
Yeah, and there's another one, dedicated servers for £29 a month. That seems relevant.
Yeah.
Albeit a little bit expensive, I must say.
I'm sure our commercial partners have a great value offer in that.
Yeah, but I mean, so presumably these are not cookie based, or are they? I don't know. I mean, if everything was HTTPS, would your adverts work?
Honestly, I don't know. I don't understand these computer things.
Well, it says Google Ad Services, so I would imagine probably it wouldn't. So what Jessie said is kind of true. If your site was HTTPS, then you probably wouldn't be able to have relevant adverts like that. They'd probably just be irrelevant stuff like the Daily Mail or whatever.
Yeah, but what he's saying is that as a website producer, they haven't got those people tied in. So there must be a case of they've selected those adverts to be on there, and while you might be able to see Google Ads Services in there somewhere, it may not be what is actually being used to show those adverts because, as Andrew was saying, he's happy with O'Reilly being on there and everyone can see it because the people who go into the website, let's be honest, are probably going to be interested in open source conferences and things. It seems like a sensible marriage. Whereas if I'd have gone on there and it had shown me, hypothetically, Bluetooth headphones, which I have been researching recently, I would have known that it wouldn't have been secure because he would have seen, or not he, but the advert system would have seen that I'd been researching Bluetooth headphones, and therefore I would have known it wouldn't have been secure.
Yeah, we have a deal with O'Reilly directly. I seem to recall conversations taking place where Google has served up ads to us that we don't want, so we've had to get in touch with them somehow to block them. But we don't screen in advance, I don't think, anyway. But yeah, if we don't like it, then we get it taken off.
Fair enough. So I suppose the conclusion of this then is pretty much it's not going to happen. Encryption is going to continue thanks to things like GPG and free software. We're not going to ever end up, hopefully, in a situation where it is enforceably banned. Even if the government does ban encryption, it's just not workable at all because of free software. And so even if it's an underground fork hosted on some Tor site, hidden services or whatever, those who want to encrypt things will continue to be able to do so. Yeah,
I agree those that want to encrypt things will be able to do so, but why does everyone not use those encryption methods already? Why do we have a news story from a couple of weeks ago that the guy who produced GPG didn't actually use it himself? Yeah. It's because they're difficult. It's because they're awkward. And the problem is that yes, you can, and yes, you and I and Andrew and I may well be using it even if this sort of dictatorship comes into play and you can't use encryption or you have to use their encryption, we can go and use an open version. But let's look at a far more reasonable prospect, which is WhatsApp, for example. That's encrypted. And if the UK government says, WhatsApp, to be using that in this country, you must comply with our encryption methods, and our encryption method is the one with a backdoor in it that we use, and WhatsApp say, okay, we would like to have all our users in the UK. We will follow your encryption method. Who is going to stop using WhatsApp because of that? No one. I certainly wouldn't. WhatsApp's really useful. It's really great. And so I think the problem we have is that while you're absolutely right, Joe, there are always going to be good, proper encryption methods that the government can't touch. The problem will be in the easy services, which might have to bend over backwards to meet stupid government requirements. And they're the easy services that everyone will use. And then before you know it, actually, all your data is available. That's the worst case that I see.
Well, I'll just stick to Telegram and talk to the one person that is also on there. So with that, we're coming to the end of another Linux Luddites. You can email us at show@linuxluddites.com, find us on Twitter or the Google Plus or Facebook communities, or leave a comment on the website. Thanks for joining me, Jessie, and thanks to everyone for listening. We'll see you again next week for more Linux news, reviews, comment, and generally being grumpy.
Bye all, and we'll see Paddy next week.
See you later.